Good morning, Commercial Committee. It is now 10:30, and I am excited to call today's meeting to order. I'm Charlondra Thompson, your 2022 Committee Chair, and Parvez Malik is our Vice Chair. First things first, I would like to let you all know that the Texas Realtors Winter Meeting is concluding today after the Board of Directors meeting. I attended and learned a lot and learned some interesting updates during the Legal 1 and Legal 2 class. And I encourage you to enroll in those classes as soon as you can. Also, Samantha Brown, Director of Team Texas, spoke about economic development in Texas, trends, and the pandemic's impact on foreign and domestic investments in Texas. I did receive her presentation, and I'll be sure to share that with Steve so we can get that out to everyone as well. Steve, do you have anything that you would like to share about winter meeting?
I thought that the commercial meetings were quite good. There was a lot of opportunity to talk and meet other members. And I think one point Samantha made about the Economic Development Office in Texas was important. Texas is the only state where the Economic Development Office is not statewide, it's local. So in addition to handling things on an international level, most of what the Team Texas office does is refer things to the local offices. So it's important that you know who your local economic development offices are and that you make contact with them for your sellers' needs in particular.
Okay. Thank you, Steve. The next item on our announcements is in regards to the NAR legislation meeting, which will be held May 1st through the 6th in Washington, D.C. at the National Harbor situated on the banks of the Potomac River. So that is going to be very exciting to pretend that it'll be at the Gaylord National Resort and Convention Center. The estimated attendance this year is about 9,000 realtors and guests. The estimated number of exhibitors is about 100, and registration for this conference opens tomorrow, February 16th, 2022. And we'll be sure to drop that link in the chat. Steve, do you have anything you would like to add?
No, I have nothing else to add. We have an exciting meeting coming up in Washington, and I look forward to seeing as many of you there as can make it. It'll be a lot of fun.
Okay, thank you. And now we would like to get started with our forum, and I would like to introduce our speakers for today. We have with us Lu Chen. She is a senior economist, at Moody's Analytics. I can't speak this morning. She has worked in the commercial real estate industry in customer success capacity for over a decade. Lu has deep knowledge in urban economics and credit risk, with special focus on the Texas market performance, senior housing, and urban migration. Thomas DeSalva is a senior economist at Moody's Analytics, and he specializes in commercial real estate. With over a decade of industry and academic experience, Thomas brings a detailed focus to his extensive research into space and capacity market performance. In addition to presenting his findings to a variety of clients and organizations, his insights are frequently published in leading industry and wider audience periodicals. Prior to joining Moody's Analytics, Dr. La Silvia was an industry consultant while also serving as a lecturer of economics at the College of William and Mary. I would like to welcome you both, Lu Chen and Dr. De La Silva. The stage is now yours.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. Both of us are incredibly happy to be here today. We do have a lot of pretty pictures for you, so let me share my screen. All right. I was going to say the obligatory question, can you see my screen? But Steve already gave me the thumbs up. So I'm going to take that as a positive. Yeah, once again, just a really big thank you. It's a true pleasure. Lou and I talk about this to each other all the time, so we might as well talk to you guys about all this great stuff going on. And the subtitle here has some meaning. So finding the new equilibrium. The economy, commercial real estate has seen just a tremendous amount of shocks in the last couple of years, and I feel like I may be getting ahead of myself, but I feel like maybe we're over some of those shocks and we're working our way towards seeing what that new equilibrium looks like. And so we'll kind of talk about that as we go through the full presentation today. And by the way, feel free to butt in and ask questions, or you're welcome to ask them at the end. So either way, I'm very happy to take questions even during the presentation. All right, so very quick agenda here. Really interesting time, right? There's seemingly contradicting data everywhere. From the CRE performance perspective, we'll go over really quickly the great, some of the good, and some of the more worrisome sectors. But that will be really brief because I want to leave a lot of time for what Lou is going to talk about below in regards to specific Texas and Dallas-Fort Worth. Economic performance and the forecast, will go through some details about the economy. And then once again, Lou's going to take over when it comes to Texas. All right, so jumping right here in, want to talk maybe 5-10 minutes about what we're seeing from the national perspective and what we're seeing as being trend-worthy, right? Or what's the rhetoric out there in real estate that I think is really getting a lot of attention. So first of all, from the multifamily perspective, it was really an unprecedented recovery. I know we tossed that word around quite a bit, but it truly, truly was. When you compare what had happened with the 01-02 recession and 08-09 and the recoveries after that, compared to what really happened in 2021 in terms of effective rent growth, vacancy steadying, if not declining, across the country, it was quite incredible. It was nothing like we've ever seen. We have 20 years of history right here, but even going back another 20 years before that, we never have seen data quite like what we saw in this past year. And of course, very strong demand. Some of it was stimulus related. Some of it was, a lot of wealth generated through stock markets, although you don't want to look at your 401ks right now. But, there was this move to upgrade, let's split with roommates, all of these things that were really driving demand in 2021, and that helped push effective rent to new highs. Now, as we move forward, and Lou's going to touch upon some of these things, we're watching affordability, right? Rent to income ratios are going up quite a bit, obviously, when you have that type of rent growth. We're also watching migration very closely. Texas, there's a lot of in-migration, right? But we're also checking on intra-metro migration. What's happening with urban areas versus suburban areas, and how is that story unfolding? All right, so as I said, I'm going to go through some of these big sectors very quickly, and then Lou will take care of the more detail later. So from the office perspective, still concerns out there, still more questions than answers, but we're starting to get a little bit more clarity. And I think as Omicron gets cleared away, there should be kind of a big push to back to office. And we kind of still are expecting that. Obviously, some of the workers have been emboldened, especially the longer they have been able to be at home. And if they're happy and comfortable there will be some that will maybe quit, right? Or will look for other jobs, or really push their employers to allow them to stay home. But we just don't see that as being enough to really cause much additional stress in the office market than what we've already seen. And already the second half of 2021 was pretty good. We actually saw turnarounds. We saw absorption turn positive. And for the full year 2021, it was positive. Effective rent growth in the second half of the year, we still saw an overall decline in effective rent for 2021. But the second half of the year, there was that bit of a turnaround. All right. Obviously, we're watching for office use. What does that work from home, work from anywhere, hybrid, whatever term you want to use? What does that look like? But we're also looking at flight to quality. There's a lot of rhetoric out there regarding this. So far in our data, there's not been enough of it to really move the needle to say that B and C are doing incredibly poorly and only A and trophy properties are doing great. But we're watching that very, very closely. From the industrial perspective, there's really not much else to say than it was a very, very good year, right? From both the flex R&D submarket, the warehouse distribution subsector, both of those saw incredible absorption numbers, record-setting absorption numbers that caused that green line of vacancy to plummet throughout mostly the second half of 2021. And we saw effective rent growth rise tremendously in those quarters. So once again, industrial, very, very strong. Obviously, e-commerce is helping to push that. The expectation that e-commerce is growing certainly is a big, big impetus for this. But, our price is getting too high. Is there speculative demand out there? Right. I mean, these are the types of things that we're watching. We just kind of saw Amazon say that they're taking a little bit of a rest on what they're doing in terms of buying up properties. And so we're going to see if other companies are going to follow suit. Do they feel like the market has overheated a little bit in terms of the price point? I don't think so. I think there's still plenty of room for rent growth, plenty of opportunities out there to still have the vacancy rates drop. And but we're going to be watching all of that very, very closely. Now, of course, we mentioned e-commerce and, will e-commerce kill brick and mortar? Well, retail anyway. And, obviously, e-commerce had to rise dramatically very early on in 2020 when the pandemic was at its heights and we were all very, very scared to do anything at all out of our homes. And so e-commerce, jumped up very quickly to about 30% growth in terms of retail spending. And non-e-commerce, brick and mortar essentially declined. But then very quickly, late in 2020, that switched in a sense, at least from the growth perspective. And brick and mortar came back. And even if you look through 2021, brick and mortar did just fine, right? And I think this is really telling for us that, I say not so fast there. In-person did quite well, right? There's this omni-channel world. There's this experiential retail. There's grocery anchored. There's traditional retail that still is here to stay in a lot of ways. So we've seen that and we're noticing that in the data as well. So here we're looking at our retail data. The title here, surprisingly steady. This goes all the way back to 2000. Red is your demand side, your net absorption. Blue is completion. Those are the bars. And the green is the vacancy percentage. And so, when you really look at what has been happening, it is this true combination of limited supply growth with slightly better than expected net absorption, where really we only saw a very, very slight negative net absorption right at later into 2020. And so, at this point, we've seen absorption already turn positive. We're expecting that to really boost in the next couple of years, not at an extreme level, right? At least from the national perspective, right? Certainly not, as you look at the left-hand side of this chart, certainly not the type of absorption and completion figures that we saw in the early 2000s, but getting closer to what we saw in the last decade, right? And so we're watching all of this very closely. Still, kind of old news now. This is where we are seeing a little bit more trouble for the B and C class properties, especially in more troubled submarkets where you're seeing some out migration. And then, the other thing we're watching really closely, exciting in a lot of ways, is the repurposing element, right? And it's beginning to make a lot of economic sense. I don't know what you guys are seeing in your local markets, but we are tracking this closer and closer. And the interesting part to me is that there's a model now, right? It's showing that we can repurpose towards mixed use, multifamily, office, medical office, even industrial. There are these models out there. And from an economic perspective, when there's actual models that are being shown to work, then it's a lot easier to get financing. It's a lot easier for investors to say, let's move forward with this type of repurposing that we want to do with this old mall or whatever it may be. And so I think that's really encouraging, that we're maybe not going to have a tremendous amount of, say, fully vacant properties that are an eyesore for communities, but there are potentials to repurpose where it doesn't make sense for it to be a full retail space anymore. So that's exciting there. All right. So section 2, the economy. So we see what's been happening very generally from the real estate perspective. As I said again, Lou is going to go into a lot more detail into all of these, in particular from the Texas markets. But I think we're seeing that there's been, this really great CRE performance for a couple of markets, and then some better than expected. I think better than expected for office as well as for retail. And a lot of what's behind that is we bounced back a lot faster than originally thought. So on this chart here, your dashed orange line is the pre-pandemic forecast, right? Very steady, simple forecast moving forward in terms of what real GDP would look like. Fast forward to December 2020 vintage, right? That's going to be your green line. So we already went through quite a bit of the pandemic at that point. And what did our macroeconomists think at that point? Well, they thought we would recover somewhere, getting close to recovery. Actually, if you take a look at that, it never quite recovers by 2025, meaning that the green line and the orange line don't quite touch until the very end, but it gets closer to recover into 2023. And then we kind of get to that long range growth path. But what's interesting about this is come December 2021, and I know there's some issues, and we'll talk about some of the issues in a second of what's happened since December 2021. But if you take a look at that vintage forecast, we bounced back a lot faster, and we were going to be back on our path and exceeding our path, right? Going back to that whole, what's the new equilibrium, where we're going to be exceeding that path into 2023, right? Late 2022 and into 2023. So that was really encouraging. And that really, I think, helped commercial real estate. All that growth in 2021 and the expectations of a lot of growth into the future really helped commercial real estate in 2021 and the second half of 2021. So very quickly here, what did we finish? Last year, we finished with a 5.7% real GDP rate. All right, pretty tremendous for the United States. Haven't seen anything like that in 40 years. And real GDP for this year, 3.7%. Now, what's interesting about that forecast is a couple of months ago, it was about 5%. So we are taking away little by little some of our bullishness on real GDP here. Omicron undoubtedly hurt. Our real-time forecast for Q1 GDP are looking about 0.5%. Annualized. So first quarter is going to come in pretty low. So don't be shocked when you see that number in a couple of months that the first quarter did hurt due to mostly from Omicron ramping up. We definitely saw travel take some pain. Spending, initial estimates of spending was a little bit weak. Lots of labor market issues in terms of lack of an hours worked. And then finally, build back better keeps being stripped down. And, there's a lot in there that was going to push GDP up inflation issues aside, there's a lot of debate as to if we should go with higher Build Back Better or lower or any version of it, but it's being stripped down and the likelihood of getting anything substantial is a lot lower now. And that is taking off some of those real GDP numbers for this year. All right, but we're still relatively bullish, right? 3.7% still exceeds anything we saw in the last decade plus, right? I mean, so it's still pretty darn strong. If you just, separating out last year, 3.7 would still be quite strong. And so why are we still bullish? Because we still see a lot of potential in the labor market. Currently, we're still about 2.9 million jobs off of what we were prior to the pandemic. So there's a lot of room there to grow. What's going on here in the labor market is definitely more supply driven than demand driven. We know that there's tremendous job openings out there near record highs. Quits are still at record highs. There's still a lot of workers that weren't working due to illness, due to Omicron in particular. And you see that spike in January. It's pretty incredible what had happened there with Omicron in terms of people that could not work because they were ill, or part-time because they were ill, or because they were taking care of people that were ill. And by the way, that data is coming from the Census Pulse survey. If you haven't seen that, it's a very interesting survey out there. And so that's a really big factor here in ultimately what's going on and why we think we can ultimately close that gap if and when some of these variants either stop or they become mild enough to keep people really working, or the days missed limited. All right, but what about Omicron, right? I mean, travel did decline. The blue line here are amount of travelers via TSA throughput data. And the orange line is our COVID cases. And so, it's very clear that as cases rise, the amount of travelers as a high frequency indicator goes down. And no doubt about it, that absolutely had happened during Omicron, but we are starting to see a little bit of a bounce back there. The other thing to note here, and this is a complete aside, but there was really no major autumn decline. And we really did expect to see a much bigger autumn decline than normal. And, because of business travel, right? We thought once leisure travel dried up a bit, if people weren't traveling for business, then you were going to see a lot less travelers overall. And that was going to have knock-on effects for particular communities, right? And some of those, Dallas, where a lot of travelers come in, but San Diego, Orlando, you could think of all those markets where a lot of conferences, a lot of business travel are. And, while we didn't see as many conferences, as much business travel, it still it wasn't at the level that I thought a lot of people might have expected, which is a really encouraging sign. And of course, we have to talk about inflation, right? So about 7.5% annualized right now. But, energy and auto have been some of the main culprits here that have been pulling up all prices. That whiplashing supply and demand, the supply chain issues. And if you look at the graph here, it's gas, used cars, energy, utilities, meats, new vehicles, right? So it's that auto and it's that energy side of things that are really pulling up. Another way to look at it, here's a graph coming from BLS data and through some of our macro folks, where they really focused on what were the true issues in terms of inflation. And if you take a look, the orange line being energy, right? And the blue line being supply chain, the green line being the general reopening of the economy. And, really trumping that green line is supply chain issues and energy, right? As being the main issues driving inflation. And so on the right-hand side, I said, well, these issues can be resolved, and they were kind of being resolved, but Russia and Ukraine, right? And we're seeing now oil prices head towards $100 a barrel, very close at this point, right? And of course, more variants we'll have to watch there. Once again, though, we were seeing some positive either projections or actual outcomes. The left-hand graph here was the global oil supply and demand. Now, this is separate than people buying up oil because they're concerned of war and what's going on in Russia and Ukraine right now. So, we're still forecasting that supply should outpace demand for oil into 2022. And so that's a really, really positive sign when it comes to those energy prices. And then we also have a supply chain index that we built about a year and a half or so ago. And finally, over the last few months, last quarter four and into the first quarter, that has started to come down, less stress or more normal, getting closer to more normal stress from the supply chain issues. All right, so those are positive signs, but still, as we all know, interest rates are absolutely going to be rising. They have been rising, and they will continue to rise. The Federal Reserve will absolutely boost the Fed funds rate in the March meeting, likely 50 basis points instead of that 25 basis points that had been kicking around a few weeks ago. They see the strong labor market. They see that not only consumer prices up 7.5%, but I think it was yesterday or even this morning, I forgot, producer price index were up over 9.5%. So there is definitely an issue here that the Fed's going to have to act. And, obviously we all know that's going to have knock-on effects or potential knock-on effects to different rates throughout the economy. And so with that said, how have interest rates and CRE related to each other historically, right? So this is an interesting graph. It goes all the way back to 1980. And it's looking at cap rates of our main 4 food groups in commercial real estate: apartment, industrial, office, and retail. And it's looking at the U.S. Treasury. Now, we all know the U.S. Treasury has been trending down, and this really clearly shows it. It's pretty incredible how it has been trending down over these years since it had to be really, since interest rates had to be really high in the 1980s to take care of that inflation. Little by little, they've been going down as monetary policy has been changing and adjusting. But generally, right, I mean, the expectation, the theory out there that economists have been using forever is that if interest rates go up, well, that should mean that cap rates should rise, right? And so, that is true theoretically, but in practice, the relationship's actually been pretty weak. And you can kind of see that on this graph here, where are some instances where when you get a little spike in the Treasury, the 10-year Treasury being used here, cap rates might boost a little bit, but it's not really there, right? The explanation of cap rates goes much, much deeper ultimately than interest rates. So what are our expectations here? Our expectations are that maybe a slight cap rate increases for many of the sectors, but more than that is a declining spread, right? The market sentiment is that within commercial real estate, the risk is still pretty low, and it's enough to take increasing interest rates at a relatively slow and steady pace in stride to not really boost cap rates in a significant way. If anything, we'll get some compression there. But we are a little bit worried about some weak assets and refinancing, depending on how quickly some of those rates do go up. So that is actually worth noting and taking a closer look at. And then finally, rents do have some room to grow here, right? So this is another interesting graph as it relates to inflation, interest rates, rent, and then finally affordability here, which I know Lou is going to talk a little bit more about. The orange line here is effective rent indexed, right? So all of these are indexed as of 2000. So you could really compare effective rent. And by the way, this is multifamily. So multifamily effective rent at the national level versus inflation, the CPI index, versus median income growth across the country, which is the gray line. And so you see that right around 2014, rent growth really started to surpass overall inflation rate. And it has, and that gap's been widening a bit, which is kind of interesting. But median income also has been growing, right? And it's been growing at a pretty decent pace, not quite the same as rent growth, but enough where if wages continue to keep pace, there is still room for rents to rise. And that will help that kind of bullishness with overall commercial real estate. But all of this implies that we have to have faith in the Federal Reserve, right? We all know that they have the dual mandate to keep us near full employment and steady prices, right? And so they're going to have to balance that in the best way possible. And they're the ones right now that they're at the plate, right, to get this right. I have faith in them. Probably some of you on this call maybe don't have faith in them due to past histories and things that have been done. But I think they've kind of figured out monetary policy in a pretty solid way at this point. And I do have faith that they're going to be able to achieve this. In addition to some of the supply chain issues being resolved, that they might not have to act as aggressively as you may think. My concern, though, still out there is some of the oil price issues, the Russia-Ukraine issue, and obviously if there's any more variants. So, all right, that was about 25 minutes or so. Hope that made a lot of sense for a lot of folks out there. If not, like I said, you can, ask some questions now, or certainly, I know Lou is going to touch upon a tremendous amount of this in some more detail and specific to the Texas markets. And we're happy to answer those questions later on too.
Thomas, one question that is being asked is whether or not you'll be willing to share your slides with us.
Absolutely. 100%. Okay. So we'll share the full deck. There's a couple of things. Yeah, absolutely. We'll send them. There's a couple of things I want to make sure that we have the right sources down there before we send them. So give me another day before I do that. But yeah, absolutely. 100%. We'll send the full deck to you guys.
Great. Thank you.
All right. So then let me stop sharing, and unless anybody has a quick question, I'm happy to field that now. Otherwise, we'll pass the baton over to Lou.
Thank you, Tom. Let me just get my screen sharing up and running. Just bear with me 1 second. Alrighty, let me go to the projection mode. Alrighty, can you see a big bold Texas on the screen, everybody? Perfect. Okay, I actually chopped it up into 3 sections because I realized it's probably easier for me to talk about the market trend, the fundamentals, and the future. So here we go, CRE performance for Texas market. And in particular, I want to zoom into Dallas and Fort Worth market while we're going through the data points. All right, just like what Tom did, when looking at the CRE market performance, I would usually like to put the numbers into perspective. And to do so, I've charted the vacancy on this screen on the left-hand side with over 20 years of data points. And then we can easily zoom into the ups and downs since the start of the pandemic crisis. So I would like to start from the apartment market first. Personally, I care really much, equally as the rest of the market sectors. So the peak of the market stress was really manifested during the subprime crisis around 2008. So COVID pandemic really affects the vacancy rate, but to a much smaller scale. So new completion in Dallas slowed down, but the corporate expansion and young adult in-migration remained robust. Vacancy of Dallas apartment market plunged by 100 basis points in the third quarter of 2021 and stayed flat towards the year end to close 2021 at a 5.3%. And that number put us to be lower than its pre-pandemic level. And Fort Worth, on the other hand, was rather resilient to the pandemic impact. Overall, the vacancy for 2021 stayed flat at 4.6%. So it was 4.6 for 2020 and 4.6 for 2021, which is 10 bips lower than the national average and 80 basis points lower than the Southwestern regional average. The fourth quarter apartment market activities was relatively mild after a very stellar performance in the third quarter. On the right-hand side, I'm also trying to just play around with the effective rent growth. So in the past 20 years, this is what Tom has showed earlier in his presentation slides. And if we zoom in, the rent decline in 2020 was very similar to the subprime crisis but the recovery was super strong. Dallas apartment rent was down only by 1.1% in 2020 and was back up, I'm taking a deep breath, 12.5% in 2021, which is similar to the nation. Effective rent together with the stabilizing occupancy already signal a full recovery of the Dallas apartment market. Fort Worth, on the other hand, really weathered through the pandemic. It has a positive 0.6% increase in effective rent in 2020 and another 11.4% increase in 2021. And if we really just zoom into the Class A and Class BC of the apartments, and for both Dallas and Fort Worth, Class A outperformed Class B and C because it's very popular. It attracts a lot of leasing activities for the younger population in general. Office. So that's a little different in terms of where the peaks and troughs are. So over the 20 years, dot-com bubble really hurt the office sector much more severe than any other time. So when we put into perspective, when pandemic hits, office was once again slammed due to the economy shutdown and the remote working options. And Dallas economy recovery was significantly outpaced than the national average. That business boom has sustained Dallas office market turnaround in the third quarter last year throughout the end of 2021. So overall, demand was trending up in October and November, but slid a little in December, which is reflective of the rising concern over the Omicron variant. And also as inflation put downward pressure on new construction and return to office plan gets further pushbacks, new office construction remained low in the second half of 2021 for Dallas. Vacancy rate remained its downward trend 3 quarters in a row. In Q4 2021, Fort Worth office market recovery has embraced a long-expected momentum created by the strong net absorption. Abundant small to medium-sized firms has created robust demand, especially in the Class B and C office market. And there is an emerging trend of satellite office establishment in Fort Worth, and that will continue to boost the overall market demand. And due to high demand combined with low construction delivery, vacancy trended down actually for the first time since a year ago. On the rent front, pandemic affected office effective rent growth, but to a much lesser degree as compared to the dot-com bubble. And Dallas effective rent was down by 1.1% in the first year of pandemic and then trended upwards since the second quarter of 2021. Fort Worth tells really that success story of the small to medium-sized companies, which helped with the effective rent to stay flat in 2020 and even increase. You see that little spike up there by 4.3% in 2021. So that's why I used the subtitle, the tailwind, the headwind. So really you see the interesting battle between what is going to push the market supply and demand, but we're still facing with a lot of uncertainties ahead of us. Okay, retail. I think Tom has spent tremendous amount of time talking about retail, in particular, the popularity of the e-commerce and its impact on the traditional neighborhood shopping center, community shopping center, and do we really see retail is dying? So the subtitle suggesting it is not, and it's reviving, not just in Texas, but also for the rest of the nation. So the retail market performance is really driven. So if you look at the lines over here, the increase of the vacancy has started even prior to the pandemic, right? So that is driven by the fundamentals leading there. And also it's negatively affected by the exogenous shock due to a sudden change of consumers' behavior. So at the beginning of the pandemic, people really didn't have a choice. And that really hurt the small retailers badly. And it surprisingly had a decent recovery in 2021. You see that downward sloping starting at the beginning of 2021, which is suggesting a potential turnaround. And Dallas is more sensitive to changes in consumers' behavior because it has higher than national average rate of the young population, and it has a good amount of high-tech employees. And I do have a couple of other slides showing where that high-tech employees really are working. So in the first half of 2021, net absorption, which is a measurement we usually use for approximating the demand, was strongly positive. It's not shown on this chart, but I'm just trying to putting the number into perspectives. So that net absorption was strongly positive when more residents are feeling safer to return to indoor dining, entertainment, retail shopping, and thinking of that very good summer, which almost feels like everything is back to normal. And that momentum is actually continued, although we have the Delta variant, which temporarily reversed the upward trend of that demand with a 50% quarter-over-quarter net absorption decline in the third quarter. And there is another 38% of drop in the fourth quarter. Demand for community centers show more volatilities than the neighborhood shopping center during the pandemic, because the neighborhood shopping center are more agile in adapting to the consumer preference changes over the course of the pandemic. Fort Worth, on the other hand, turned the corner in the third quarter of 2021. And again, when we talk about demand of the market, the total net absorption of the year was actually positive. And something unique for the Fort Worth retail market is the fast food restaurant, convenience store, and drugstores are popular forms which will continue to drive the retail market's demand. And vacancy stayed flat at 11.9%, ending 2021 back to its 11% that range. And the non-anchor tenants are gradually gaining the steam due to their adaptability. Oh, I cannot speak for a second. While on the other hand, the anchor tenants continue to struggle in this economy with many short-term uncertainties. On the effective rent front, so the good news is effective rent growth in both Dallas and Fort Worth stayed positive for 2021. And Dallas actually outperformed the nation and Fort Worth because the economy is more active and the recovery is stronger and better. And more constructions are invested in the neighborhood shopping center. And the asking rent grew much faster in that arena. Moving on to my favorite part, industrial, always good, just like the rest of the nation. But uniqueness about Dallas and Fort Worth market is logistics is always the essential component of this economy. And of course, the e-commerce business and restructuring of the supply chain has created unique opportunities for the warehouse and distribution center in both Dallas and Fort Worth. And the vacancy declined with a 210 basis point to 10.9% in 2021, a speed which we have not seen over the past decade. On the supply side, new delivery tightened up a little bit in 2021 because there was massive completion happening in 2020, while other sectors seems to stagnate a little bit. And the past quarter, the Q4 2021 actually contributed nearly half of the annual addition for the new construction completion. Fort Worth also had a record-setting quarter in the first quarter 2021. Not only the net absorption rate was at its 13-year high, the vacancy decline was also historic and set the overall market performance well above its pre-pandemic level. And I actually got a little snippet from the Fort Worth Chamber of Commerce. The official says it is actively working on more than 100 relocation and expansion projects, with around 75% of them focused on manufacturing and industrial. I guess that's a good piece of news for Fort Worth industrial market right there. On the right-hand side, the rent rise, it has a fast-growing third quarter, and the effective rent growth moderated towards the year end. But overall, both Dallas and Fort Worth are still more robust than the national original average. Last bit, hotel. Comparing with 2021, comparing 2021 with the roller coaster ride in 2020, and I was not exaggerating. So look at that occupancy. So usually when we talk about hotel, it's a little different because for other sector, we talk about vacancy, but over here, we usually measure by the occupancy. So the downward trend is actually indicating the opposite side of information. So down is bad, up is good. And look at the 2020 when pretty much the leisure and the business travel got heavily slammed by the COVID pandemic. That was my so-called roller coaster ride in 2020. So 2021, it has that dampened volatility in the hotel occupancy. It signals more stability in the market overall, but we still see the performance pendulum. That's my favorite term. I took it from Victor's presentation. So that performance pendulum swing due to various exogenous shock. Dallas and Fort Worth both benefited early on in February, the winter storm Uri, which created a strong demand, which is kind of unexpected to the hospitality. And then the recovery actually further accelerated while the economy gradually reopened during the summertime. In fall, the occupancy was temporarily buoyed up from the Delta low, but then it got hammered down by Omicron in December. So overall, we can say Dallas hotel is fully recovered, and more on the other hand, it's not recovering as fast as Fort Worth because it has a close association with the business travel. But if you really look at the RevPAR, which is a measurement of the revenue on the average hotel room, it was driven by both the occupancy and the average room rate. So although Dallas occupancy was not doing as good as Fort Worth, but it has more room for the ADR to grow. All right, so that's a quick trip over what has happened in the past 20 years versus what has happened in the past 2 years, and in particular, what happened in the second half of 2021 for the 5 major commercial real estate sectors in Dallas and Fort Worth. So I am happy to take questions, but if everybody allows me, I can also just quickly ease into the second section of the economics of growth. All right, so looking at what is all driving the CRE sector performance, we decided to revisit our economics of growth. So that basically 2 theories. On the left-hand side, this is the household-led expansion, and on the right-hand side, this is business-led expansion. I'm just going to go through quickly. So the 2 types of driving the economic expansion and growth, if this is household-led, then it usually started off with the cost and lifestyle. Should not stop prompting, it might be taxes, but if the cost and lifestyle really attracts people to migrate into a particular metro, a particular place, and then it'll create abundant labor and low wages, which will help with the business expansion and business in-migration. And once we have agglomeration of all the new business, all these good business environment, it'll continue boosting the employment opportunities, which will prompt another round of the household in-migration and further growth. But there is also another theory, which is the business-led expansion. So some places could naturally have an advantage or having some kind of productivity shock, which will prompt the business expansion and in-migration first. And then it creates all these employment opportunities, which will attract people to migrate in. And the skilled labor will continue prompts a cluster formation and further growth of the business. Where are we? I think I gave a quick clue, but I hope you didn't hear me. So here we go. Why Texas? This is the latest 2021 migration report from United Van Lines. On the left-hand side of the screen, it listed out the top categories for people to either migrate inbound or migrate outbound. So I circled, it really struck me, I circled the two categories which you see the inbound is actually more than the outbound, and it turned out to be lifestyle and cost. Lifestyle and cost on the top left corner of the household-led expansion. I think the answer is clear. And also, Texas is people's choice for people whose ages who are young and who has a median household income below $75,000. So it really attracted to that two groups in terms of the population composition. So this ties back to our economics of growth and proves that household-led expansion really drives the state's past and future. And in the latest census report, Texas ranked number 2 as the most populous state with the largest net domestic migration gains, and state with the largest net international migration gains. And the overall population tops the list according to the census latest migration report. And zooming into where we see where that population has decided to live, and you see, okay, I have to introduce where this chart is talking about, and I got it from New York Times, but they are actually taking data from US Census Bureau. So if you see the cluster, if you see the green bubbles, that's where most of the population were agglomerated. And not to my surprise, they are all in the big 5 metros in the Texas state: Dallas, Fort Worth, Austin, San Antonio, and Houston. And we have a pretty diversified racial group as well on the right-hand side, which I will touch upon later on. So in the same commentary on New York Times, and they assigned the score for 3 categories of why people decided to live in a particular area, which are jobs, climate risk, racial diversity. And interestingly, once you start giving them a score from 0 to 10, and all of these areas, so actually all these counties which have the highest score, are all agglomerated around Dallas and Fort Worth. So I think they give a very interesting title, like Dreaming of Dallas. Here we go. Yeah, so it's like this author himself was in San Francisco and he was looking for a place to move in, and it just all boiled down to Dallas for him to move. It was actually a little, interesting discussion of why he landed in here and all these different categories, but I am just happy to see that number putting up there. And looking at the fundamental, so as of 2021, I know sometimes the bar is not obvious, but I try to just do the tally, looking at the total employment and split it up into the office employment and industrial employment. And it's pretty telling. Dallas has fully recovered all the jobs which has lost during the pandemic. It recovered and went above and beyond. So Fort Worth is so close to the full recovery, but even with that 1 percentage point or 2 percentage points shy here and there, it still outpaced the Southwestern region or the rest of the nation. So it's pretty impressive employment figure, which continue to boost the fundamental of the CRE market. And we also, so my team as the Moody's Analytics CRE thought leadership, we recently did a little study just to divide it up, all these big metros around the United States into the tech metros, the emerging tech metros, and the rest of the nation. And what I put up here is looking at what comes into the workforce as a skilled labor, and the share of employment in computer and math occupation for Dallas put us well in that 15 big tech metros over here. And some of the big names continue to attract the talents from elsewhere. It could be organic growth. It could also be attracting talents from California, from New York, from elsewhere. I was just talking to my husband's cousin over the weekend who works in Apple, and the entire group of their hardware development actually just recently moved to Texas. And they are actually all geared up without a doubt. And they also complain, well, they housing market is really hot. The apartment market is really just hiking up the price. I was like, yeah, so that's what we are looking for as well. And also on the rating agency side, on the rating agency side, we do differentiate how much high-tech employment would be for as a percentage of the total workforce. And Dallas is well above the United States national average. So Fort Worth is a little shy, but overall, when we look at the Dallas, Fort Worth, Arlington metro, our position is really strong in terms of technology. On the other hand, over here, the income growth, so the green and the blue put us well above the national income growth for 2021. And that leveled up before it stabilizes will continue throughout the 2022 this year. Affordability, because when we are talking about all these strong momentums, when we are talking about the strong fundamental, on the other hand, I'm personally interested in finding out how affordable our Texas market still is and how we are doing in Dallas and Fort Worth. And interestingly, we're still in a very good position in terms of attracting the in-migration of the population. So the percentage number you are seeing on the screen is taken by the monthly rent divided by the annual income. So I was using December data for this measurement. And surprisingly, all 5 Texas metros have been ranking as the most affordable as compared to many other counterparts around the nation. And I'm feeling pretty good about it still. So with that all being said, I'm ready for my forecast, risk, and opportunities. But do let me know if you have any questions in between. Okay. Steve, if I'm having trouble looking at my chat, let me know if you see any interesting questions pop up there. Okay.
We do have one, Lou. They're asking about rent projections for second quarter for retail for neighborhood strip shopping centers. I don't know if you get to that level of detail, but I thought you'd not know the questions there.
Absolutely. That's a good question. I have to promote that we do have the inside reports, which includes much granular details for each of the metros we're discussing here. I would just, for the time being, I wasn't able to include the statistics in the presentation, but I'm happy to follow up. All right. So talking about affordability, so when we move on to the forecast, maybe we can carry on with that topic. I did a little research, and this is a very interesting chart I got from St. Louis Fed. The housing inventory, the next slide is the housing price. So I charted, what I did is to pull out the Dallas market, to put out the Texas market, just to do a quick comparison, because when everybody was saying the housing inventory was low, was it really low? And it turned out to be the 5-year low. Sure, it is low. On the other hand, the housing price increase has accelerated in 2021. So why am I putting these 2 charts here is really tie back what Tom mentioned at the very beginning of the presentation. So when the generation are looking for apartment alternatives, well, naturally, the single family housing would be a good conduit. But the problem is, if we are having a very low inventory and the price continue to increase, it might force people to stay in the apartment, which, well, I guess is not too bad a thing in terms of the market fundamental. And our forecast, so we are looking at 2 years into the pandemic, and both Dallas and Fort Worth should be very close to an equilibrium. So we did forecast the construction and net absorption. And what I usually look is the relatives. So we have the construction to net absorption ratio, which is projected to linger around 1/1. So they are at the equilibrium. So if you have 1 unit produced, you have 1 unit being absorbed. So which allows the vacancy to stay in the low 5s for Dallas. And it'll also put Fort Worth around this 4.6%, which is if you remember what we went through in the earlier slides, the ratio, the vacancy rate we have for 2020 and 2021. So we may stay there in the near term. And the rent growth, which is what I put on the right-hand side of the screen, is expected to slow down and stabilize as inflation pressure eases, fingers crossed, and market stabilizes. Okay. As I mentioned earlier, when we're moving on to studying the industrial market, oftentimes I like to see this economic drivers. So I put Dallas and Fort Worth side by side, and you can see logistics is the common area where we see is the backbone of the economy. And of course, if you love reading about the strengths and weaknesses, and I'm also happy to share the screen, but to put into the industrial market forecast. So the strong demand in the warehouse and distribution center really incentivize a robust short-term construction pipeline for 2022. Taking Dallas as an example, 3 times more warehouse and distribution space will come online in the next 12 months as compared to 2021. And net absorption will further grow by 40% and possibly setting a new record. So I know Tom is worried about all these news putting up by Amazon, would any other firm follow, but I'm still very positive for Texas. We can see we'll extend its downward trend and drop below 10% after 2022. And for Fort Worth, more speculative warehouse and distribution center projects are underway, and the forecasted net absorption will remain even higher than the inventory growth. So that'll put that ratio construction to net absorption to be below 1, which is a strong boost of the market fundamental. On the right-hand side, effective rent will continue to grow in a 4 to 5% range. Okay, moving on to office. I have been working from home since beginning of March 2020. Not sure about you guys, but I'm so sick and tired of it. So overall, I got this data from Census Bureau. This is the US work from home ratio. It really come down since the beginning of 2021. It still have some ups and downs because it really changes according to the different waves of the variant. It changes with more companies pushing their return to work plan. I actually see I think I do have a slides. It's in the later slides. I promise I'm going to show you, which is really put us on top of how many workforce actually return to the office. But this is the idea that although we think people are going to stay home for so long and it'll hurt the fundamental, but the reality is we are seeing some positive trend there, which will putting us back to the office space. And we also did a recent study, which was published on our platform, studying the office lease term. So there are 2 interesting lines over here. So the top one is the average lease term. If we just take a lump sum of all the leases together, and the term we were thinking, the idea is we were thinking, actually that's excluding very short leases. So we were thinking maybe we should be seeing the shortened lease term, but the reality is if we are not looking at the very short leases, then it only declined moderately by 3 months. So it's roughly from 67 to 64, or roughly around that range. What struck me is if we start including all these short leases, and then you see a significant reduction. So that really put us from over 60 to just about 45. So the reason being we are seeing a greater portion of the leases are short-term leases now. And that is dragging this average term down. So especially for smaller to medium-sized firm, which is more vulnerable in the time of uncertainty. And that is the trend where people are going for the short-term lease rather than the longer term. And on the right-hand side, I seriously think our structural engineer drew that himself, but Tom, you can correct me if I'm wrong. So we started off with the Q1 2020, where everybody started working from home. And if we continue to work from home for the next year or two, which will put us well into this transition phase, and we might see as time goes on, the share of permanently decentralized workforce may go exponentially high. So that's where we'll really start seeing it hurts the economy, but I don't think we're going there. But this is my personal opinion, and you probably often hear economists do disagree with each other. But let's, that's my favorite chart. So this is the Castle.com return to work barometer. I took it over the weekend, and I was looking at where we are in terms of returning to work. So this line is charting the percentage of people who work in the office space throughout the last 2 years. Austin, Houston, Dallas Metro are above the national average. Of course, we are not tracking every single metro, so the top 10 average. That means we Texans just love to return to the office much more than many other people around this nation. Okay, so office forecast. So the opportunity for Dallas is absolutely there, and we are forecasting a trending down for the vacancy in a short term. And I would say the momentum is really strong for Dallas, but on the other hand, Fort Worth is still facing the headwind because of all these uncertainties, all these small to medium-sized firms, and effective rent on the right-hand side will start to grow a little faster. So the near-term future is very bright for the office, at least from our forecast perspective. Retail. Okay, so retail sales, I got it from Dallas Fed. So the retail sales for Dallas in billions of dollars is actually increasing. I'm super happy to see that because I heard people saying during the COVID pandemic and residents are piling up the cash for one reason or the other, they just want to spend, but the data speaks for everything, right? So throughout the entire 2021, and we are seeing a much stronger retail spending overall for Texas. And e-commerce, how much is e-commerce contributing to this figure? So we really come down from 15.6% down to just around 13% of the total retail sales. So that is giving the room for the retail to revive. And we also published a recent paper on what makes the most retail openings. And you see the percentage point for each of the retail category, and the limited service restaurants, gasoline station with convenience store, and wireless telecommunication carrier. So all of these are the top retail forms which are seeking their opportunities throughout the pandemic. So it just means people need to eat, people need to put on the gas in their car, and that is the fundamental of the retail market. And this is the interesting graph that my team has been putting up, and Texas has the most store opening, which is even outpacing California. Okay, so retail forecast, the vacancy front, we're really seeing a stabilization over here. So Dallas, Fort Worth, you will see the vacancy started to come down, which is actually better, which is maintaining the momentum. So Texas overall is trending even stronger. But overall, I don't see any concern, significant concern over the retail forecast in the near term. And effective rent. So similar story as office, we might still seeing some ups and downs, in particular the bifurcation between the Dallas and Fort Worth in terms of what really goes into the retail form and the popular retail openings for both regions. But in the longer run, so 2023 onward, we should be seeing a much higher effective rent growth for both Dallas and Fort Worth metros. Last but not the least, this is some uniqueness with the travel industry. And Cvent, which is a web-based platform, which usually rank the business travel destinations. So Dallas ranked number 5, and Fort Worth ranked number 35 around the nation. And that actually points out to some opportunities and also uncertainties, because if Dallas is highly tied down to the business travel, it also echoes back to the uncertainties, the roller coaster, which we saw in the 2020, 2021. And the 7-day average travel throughput recovery ratio, which Tom showed earlier. And I did some manual work. So I went to the DFW International Airport TSA dataset, and I took the in-plan and de-plan data points from November 2019, because I want to account for seasonality, all the way to December 2021. That's the latest data they have. And it's very intriguing to me, because by November, and if you look at the recovery data, so domestic was recovered 100%, international 80%, overall travel recovery was well above and beyond. But in December, when Omicron hit, so that quickly dropped down to only 94% of pre-pandemic for domestic in-plan. And international was up a little bit, thinking of we actually released the travel ban in early November. So that, it balanced some of the potential losses which can be occurred because of this decline in domestic travel. And overall, put the recovery back, so it retreat from almost 150 now to only 94%. And hotel forecast, we're almost there, so be patient. The occupancy will be up in 2022 and onward. And you probably have heard many people are talking, I just can't wait, I'm so fed up, I have to go, I have to travel. So I certainly see the momentum going. And when we put the Zoom forum behind us, and maybe next time we can see face-to-face, we can do this in person. And the business travel is certainly reviving. So half of my team is right now in San Diego taking MBA forum. And they are in person, and in some of the speaker events, they are even maskless. I was a little worried for them, but that's the trend I'm very happy to see. RevPAR. So there was some interesting dynamics on the average room rate, and in particular, the third quarter of 2021. And we are seeing, if you put everything all together, so there are opportunities in 2022, maybe not to a much greater scale, but the increase of the average room rate together with the occupancy uptick will help repair the revenue growth in the short run. And I realized because I was presenting, I can't see my clock. So Steve, let me know if I talk for too much, but this is my closing remark.
We need to wrap it up.
Yes, perfect. Right. So Texas summary, this is overall an economic growth led by the household, and the pandemic acted as an unexpected secondary and amplifying shock to the demand. We're seeing large increase in the rent, and the rent to income ratio is growing, but it's still putting us in a relatively affordable place. And we are seeing a great in-migration with all these increase in skilled worker, and which is putting us in strong market fundamentals. And with every reason to believe Texas has a bright future, but I still reserve my longer term concern over certain sector which may have to go through transition in the post-pandemic era. And I'm done with my part. I will just put up the slides on the screen so you don't have to stare at my face. And this is essentially what my team is working and will continue monitoring throughout 2022. I do think, Tom, this is a very conservative list. We have much more exciting stuff coming up, and we are happy to share with the forum when the time comes.
Great, Lou. There's one question for you and Tom, asking whether or not in the industrial market will the small, medium, or large companies provide the greatest impact or benefit in terms of growth in the area?
That's a fantastic question, Lou. I'll take a quick stab at this, and I'll utilize a conversation I had with a developer recently, a developer and a broker out in Phoenix. They said there's huge demand for smaller spaces of warehouse distribution and flex R&D. Lots and lots of smaller companies are knocking on their doors saying, you know, can we have this space? Can we have that space? But the vacancy rate or the occupancy rate is basically 100% for those smaller spaces in a lot of these markets. And part of the problem is developers aren't building small spaces. It just doesn't pencil. So it's a very, very interesting situation we're seeing there. So that question, I think, is on point. Huge demand for small spaces, but very, very limited supply.
Great, Charlandra. I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Lucien and Dr. LaSalvia. Both your presentations were very informative, and thank you for agreeing to share your slides with our committee. At this time, we will have breakout rooms to network by market segment, office, industrial and land, retail and professional, hospitality, and multifamily. So please bring your needs, wants, and haves. And Steve, I will turn it over to you to open up those breakout rooms.
Great. And I have also created a breakout room if Thomas and Lou wish to hang around. There's a breakout room assigned for Q&A for the speakers. What I will do is I will open all the rooms and you'll be able to select your own rooms, which one you want to go to. If anybody has any difficulties, I'll stay in this room and I can assign you. So here we go. We'll open up all the rooms and everybody just click on the room you want.